So, I'm going to be talking to you about Purim and what it's about, and what the meaning of it is. And it's kind of funny because Pastor Mike asked me a few weeks ago if I would deliver a little message about Purim. I was the least likely person to do that because growing up in my Catholic background, we didn't know what Purim was. In fact, I would say growing up in besides that, our Baptist and Assembly of God and whatever background, we didn't know what it was either. So it's been a bit of a learning experience for me. I had to learn about it quickly, and hopefully I've done that well enough today. So first of all, what is Purim? Well, it's an annual feast celebrated by the Jews in the month of Adar. Well, when is that? That's now. Okay, it's the 12th month of the Hebrew year, and it's celebrated on the 13th day of the month. Now, it's not one of the 7 required biblical feasts, which are found in Leviticus 23. It's in addition to all those. So it's not required as such, and yet it's pretty important. You might say it is required, but in a little different way. And really what it does is it celebrates the deliverance of the Jews from an evil oppressor that intended to wipe them out, to completely wipe them out. So you might find it interesting to know that a lot of people think Esther should not even be in the Bible. For example, Martin Luther said Esther shouldn't be in the Bible because God's name doesn't appear even one time in the whole book. So besides Martin Luther, there were no doubt others that just said this book is not legitimate, shouldn't even be in the Bible. So with that in mind, I just invite you to, as we go through this, to see whether or not God was somehow involved in this book. So I'll let you guys try to pay attention to that. I'd also invite you to pay attention to some major conflict in this book. Well, there's several major conflicts, but one that I'm kind of focused on is the conflict between the Amalekites and the people of Israel. So if you go back, and I better get my glasses here, I'm going to be in trouble. Oh, they're up there. Sorry. Okay. So if you go back and pay attention to, I think it's Exodus chapter 17. And in Exodus 17, Moses was leading the children of Israel through the wilderness, and the Amalekites came out to fight with Israel. And the Amalekites were really bloodthirsty and wicked, evil people. And they were the kind of people that would pursue the Israelites, and they would kill and maim the people at the tail end of the caravan. So the weak people, the old people, the children, the Amalekites would wipe them out. So very wicked people. And so we know the story that Moses was holding up his hands. And as long as he was holding up his hands, the Israelites were prevailing. But as soon as his hands were lowered, the Amalekites would prevail. And anyway, ultimately the Israelites won that battle. And at the end, God said something to the effect that he would always be fighting the Amalekites forever. So that's the Amalekites, and we're going to see them again popping up later. And one of the main characters in this story is Haman, and he was an Agagite. Agag was the king of the Amalekites, so he was a descendant of Agag. And so we see that you have the Amalekites, but then on the other side, you're going to see that there are a couple of characters in this story that are descendants of, they were Benjamites. So they were descendants of Saul. So they were like a royal lineage of Israel. So you had the Agagites, tip of earth, represented by Haman, against the Israelites, represented by Mordecai and What's her name? Esther, sorry. Okay. So let's start with a little bit of historical background. Okay. So if you're like me, there's certain parts of the Bible I'm fairly familiar with, but then there's other areas where I'm a little fuzzy. And so I put this little chart up here just to give us a little bit of historical background. So if you go back to about 720 BC in 2 Kings, we see that Israel was taken captive by Assyria. People were carried away into Assyria and spread out all over the land. Then fast forward to 587 BC, and we see that Judah also was taken captive and taken over to Babylon. Then if you fast forward a little bit further, we see that Babylon was conquered by the Medes and Persians. And you can read about that in the book of Daniel. And then they were taken captive by King Cyrus. And then Cyrus decreed almost immediately that the Jews could return to Israel. Then a little bit further down, we see that Darius, he was one of the kings with Cyrus, decreed that the Jews could rebuild their temple. And then the book of Esther, it occurs around 480 BC, and that's the time frame for the story that we're talking about now. So that's a little bit of historical background. And when Cyrus made this decree that the children of Israel could return, you would think that they would all have immediately rushed back to Israel. But that's not the case. In fact, probably about 95% of the Israelites stayed in the Medo-Persian Empire. They didn't bother to go back to Israel. Well, why is that? Well, think about it. Israel was devastated. We think about Hamas and how Gaza is so wiped out. Well, that's a pretty good indication of kind of how Israel was at the time. They were totally obliterated. And so who would want to go from the Medo-Persian Empire, which was really a pretty well-developed empire, who would want to go from that back to this scene of devastation? So most of the Israelites that were dispersed stayed in the Medo-Persian Empire and didn't go back. Well, if you think about it, they were being disobedient to God. They should have gone back. So why didn't God just wipe his hands of these people? He could have done that. He could have said, if you don't want to come back, I'm done with you. So we'll see how this plays out. So can you move it up one slide? I guess I'm supposed to do that, aren't I? All right. Anyway, just put together a little map here for you, and it's probably a little hard to see, but this was the Medo-Persian Empire. And it was huge, and went all the way from India on the right side of the screen, all the way to Egypt and Ethiopia on the left. And where the red arrow is at, that shows you where this story takes place in Susa or Shushan, the palace of the Medo-Persian Empire, and Israel would be off to the left, right there by the end of the Mediterranean Sea. So that gives you at least some notion of where this was all at. And there were several main characters. Can you move? Yeah, there you go. Thank you. So there are really about 5 main characters. There is King Ahasuerus. Sometimes we call him Xerxes. That would be his Greek name. But Ahasuerus was a very powerful king. He ruled over this entire empire. He seemed to be easily angered and very impulsive. And he seemed to like wine. Several places in this book that they make reference to their banquets and their wine drinking. Then there was Queen Vashti, his queen, very beautiful woman, but unfortunately, at one of these drunken feasts, the king commanded that Vashti come to appear so that he could show off her beauty to all of his guests. Well, she decided that's not going to happen. She refused to come, which caused the king to become violently angry. And so his response, his advisors told him that this is a terrible thing that she's doing by not obeying you, not coming to the feast. So you should get rid of her. She should no longer be queen. So the king thought that was a good idea. He was probably a little drunk, but he thought that was a good idea, and he wrote up a decree that Vashti should never come before him again. So basically, Vashti was kicked to the curb. So something else you need to know is that when the king, this all-powerful king, whenever he would write up a decree, it could never be revoked. Can't change his mind. It's a done deal forever. So another main character is Haman, who was the prime minister of this empire. And Haman was, of course, very powerful. He was a descendant of Amalek. I think I've already mentioned that, a descendant of Amalek. And he was vain and selfish, very cruel and very vindictive. Then there's Mordecai. Now Mordecai, I think I've mentioned, he's of the royal line, so he's a Benjamite, and of the royal line of Saul. And he had been taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar many years before, so by this time he's an older man. He was Esther's cousin and caretaker. He was a very generous and loyal person. And then finally there is Esther. She's the final main character. Esther, who sometimes, that's her Persian name. Her Jewish name would be Hadassah, okay, which means myrtle, so it's a beautiful plant. But at any rate, her Persian name, being Esther, means something like something hidden. So there's a theme of things being hidden throughout this book. She was very young and beautiful, and she was obedient to her cousin Mordecai. So it was proposed that by the king's advisors that he hold this big beauty contest and locate the most beautiful young women throughout the empire and bring them to Susa, and the king would then select the one that he liked the best. So the beginning of chapter 2, thank you. You're doing great. The beginning of chapter 2 starts out, and I think the first few words says, after these things. Well, what you don't realize is that from the time that Esther was kicked out, not Esther, Vashti was kicked out, and Esther was made queen. It actually was about a 4-year period. And in this time, the king had, basically it was a 4-year period, he spent 2 years taking his army of about 1 million men to fight the Greeks. Well, that didn't go well for him. So he took about 1 million soldiers to fight. He came back with about 5,000. So that's a 95, 98, whatever % loss. So devastating loss. So he came back, and I suppose he was licking his wounds and probably thinking about his beautiful queen that he had thrown away and wanting her back. But unfortunately, the decree of the king could not be revoked. So he had a problem, and his advisors suggested just go on this search throughout the kingdom and find the most beautiful women throughout the kingdom, bring them to the palace, and we'll have this basically a beauty contest. So all these young ladies would come, and they'd get beauty treatments for basically a year. All perfumes and whatever else women do to make themselves beautiful. And then the king would select the one that appealed to him the most. And so we see that Esther was chosen to be the king, or the queen, excuse me. I'm having a hard time here, aren't I? So, now, Mordecai would hang around the harem. He wasn't doing anything bad, but he he cared about Esther, and he was looking out for her welfare. But he ordered her not to divulge that she was Jewish. So we already said that Esther found favor with the king and became his queen. And then it just so happened that one day Mordecai overheard a couple of the king's guards plotting to kill the king. So he told Esther, who then told the king. And they did an investigation and found out that this conspiracy was true. That, in fact, these two guards did intend to assassinate the king. So the king had them hanged. They were put to death. And it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles of the King. So then Haman the Agagite was plotted against the Jews. So here he was, he's the prime minister, and he took offense at Mordecai because Mordecai stood near the gate, but he would not bow down to Haman. So here's Haman, he's a very proud and arrogant man, and didn't appreciate being disrespected like that. So his solution was to plan to kill Mordecai. But not just that. He didn't want to kill just Mordecai. He decided to kill all the Jews throughout the empire. So Haman came to the king, and he told the king about a people in the kingdom that were a problem. They didn't obey the king's laws. They just were a problem, and they needed to be destroyed. So Haman paid 10,000 talents of silver. That was, I think it was like several 100,000 pounds of silver. Don't know where he got so much, but apparently he was a pretty wealthy man. He gave that to the king, and the king gave him the authority to issue a decree throughout the land to kill all the Jews. And Haman cast lots, or pur. He cast lots to determine the date. And the date that was decided upon was the 13th of Adar, which would be the 12th month. So I think today, in the Hebrew calendar, today would be the 15th of Adar. So it would have been 2 days ago. But anyway, he'd been given authority to murder all the Jews on the 13th of Adar and plunder all their property. And it says that the king and Haman sat down to drink. Once again, drinking and basically celebrating their evil plans. Okay. So, when Mordecai heard this, he went into deep mourning. Okay. He went into deep mourning. He was wailing and lying in sackcloth and ashes. Well, Esther was in the harem, and she heard about Mordecai, what he was doing. She didn't know what was going on, but she was distressed and sent him a new set of clothing to wear. But he refused to wear it. So Esther sent a servant out to ask him, what's going on? What is the problem here? And Mordecai sent her a copy of the proclamation to murder all the Jews. He sent her a copy and explained to her that according to this proclamation, on the 13th of Adar, they were supposed to kill all the Jews throughout the empire. And so Mordecai told her, you need to intercede with the king on behalf of the Jews. But Esther explained that she hadn't been summoned by the king for 30 days. And they had another rule. They had lots of rules around there. But they had another rule that if you appeared before the king without being invited, it was death. Death. Okay. So Mordecai and Esther exchanged some conversation back and forth, and finally Mordecai said, don't think that you will be spared. At this moment, the king doesn't even know you're Jewish, but he will find out. And don't think that by keeping your mouth shut and trying to lay low, that you'll be spared when this whole thing comes down. He says, if you don't speak up, relief for the Jews will come from another place. but perhaps you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So, finally, Esther agreed and requested that all the Jews fast for her for 3 days. She agreed to go to the king, and she said, "If I perish, I perish." So this is pretty clever what all happened. On the 3rd day of the fast, Esther approached the king in her royal robes. And keep in mind, she didn't really have permission to be approaching him. He could have killed her, but he didn't. She approached the king, and the king extended his golden scepter to her. And she touched the end of the scepter, which was a miracle. Like I said, she could have been killed. And the king asked her, "Well, what is your request?" And her request was that the king and Haman attend a banquet that she had prepared for that day. Well, the king and Haman attended that banquet, and afterwards the king asked her, "Well, what is your request?" And she said, "Well, please come to my banquet that I'm going to have tomorrow." Well, Haman was just delighted because he had been invited to 2 banquets with just him and the king. And he thought that was just wonderful. So he was just delighted about this. And he went home and boasted to his wife, Saresh, and his friends about his glory and how powerful he was and his high position and how many sons he had. Just couldn't get over himself. Nevertheless, he said, "But I'm really upset with this Mordecai guy. He offends me because he won't bow to me." So his wife sympathized with him, and she suggested, "Why don't you have a gallows built that's 50 cubits high and hang Mordecai on this gallows?" So Mordecai had the gallows built in his front yard. So, okay. Interestingly, that night the king could not sleep. What a great time to be having insomnia, right? So the king couldn't sleep. And so he sent for his servants to go get some of the papers out of the royal archives and read to him from the historic chronicles. So his servants read to him, and they came to the part about how Mordecai had tipped him off to this assassination plot. And in doing so, he saved the king's life. Well, the king asked his servants, "Well, what has been done to honor Mordecai for what he did? It was a great deed that he did. What have we done?" And the servant said, "Well, nothing. We haven't done anything for him." So the king asked Haman what should be done for the man that the king wishes to honor. Well, Haman thought, who would the king wish to honor more than me? I'm so special that I'm sure the king wants to honor me. So he told the king, "Well, you should put the royal robes on this person and have him ride on the king's horse and have a servant lead Mordecai through the streets, proclaiming, 'This is what the king does for the man he wishes to honor.'" So can you imagine how he must have felt he thought the honor was going to go to him, but for the honor to go to the man that he despised. So he had to walk Mordecai through the streets on this horse in the king's robes and proclaim, "This is what the king does for the man he wishes to honor." So he was deeply humiliated. And he went home, and his wife and wise men he told them what had happened to him. And his wife and his wise men told Mordecai that if Mordecai was a Jew, that Haman would not be able to overcome him. So just at that time, the king's servants came along, and they gathered up Haman, and they took him off to banquet number 2. So After the second banquet, the king asked Esther once again, "What is your request?" And she asked the king that her life and that of her people be spared, for they had been sold to annihilation. This is the first time that she divulged that she was Jewish. And the king became enraged. And he said, "Who is he and where is he who has done this?" And she said, "A foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman." And in his wrath, the king retreated to his garden just to gather his temper. He was just ready to explode. He went out to the garden to cool off. Meanwhile, Haman realized he's in serious, serious trouble. So he stayed behind to beg from Esther, "Please spare my life." Well, when the king came back in, it appeared to him that Haman was basically molesting his wife. It wasn't what he was doing, but it looked like it to the king. And the king saw what he was doing, and he says, "Would you even molest my wife in front of me?" And the king's servants came and they covered Haman's face, and somebody suggested hanging him. And the king says, "Do it, hang him on the gallows." So the irony of ironies, here he had built these gallows for Mordecai, and it turns out that he was the one that got hanged on his own gallows. At that point, the king's wrath was abated. So then the king gave Esther Haman's house, and he elevated Mordecai to be the prime minister in Haman's place. But the problem wasn't resolved. So Esther begged the king to revoke Haman's order to destroy the Jews. But what do we know about the king's orders? They cannot be revoked. Cannot be revoked. So the king couldn't repeal Haman's order, but he gave Mordecai and Esther permission to write another order, another edict. And with this edict, he authorized the Jews to gather on a single day to fight against any enemies who tried to kill them. And they could destroy them, kill them, annihilate them, and plunder their goods. So this was established to be on the same day, on the 13th day of Adar, throughout the empire. And this caused great joy and jubilation that the Jews were going to be saved. And I thought it was interesting that it said, many of the people throughout the kingdom declared themselves to be Jews for fear of the Jews. Kind of cool how that worked out. So on the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar, the Jews gained mastery over those who hated them, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. And I'm reminded about how the fear of the Lord is a powerful thing. One particular place I remember is that when Jacob's sons had wiped out this village, I think it was called Shechem. They wiped out the village of Shechem because this young man named Shechem had raped their daughter Tamar. And Jacob said, "You have made me a stench in the nostrils of these people." And so Jacob gathered up his family and they moved to another place. And instead of being attacked by all the surrounding peoples, it said that the fear of God basically kept all these other people away from him. So I thought that was interesting to see that repeated. So on the 13th day of the 12th month, the Jews gained mastery over their enemies, and it says that Mordecai grew more and more powerful, for fear of Mordecai had fallen on the royal officials. So the Jews killed 500 persons in Susa, including Haman's 10 sons, but it said they laid no hands on the plunder. I guess they really weren't interested in that. They just were interested in preserving their own lives. And at Esther's request, they also killed 300 more men in Susa on the following day, on the 14th. So on the 13th and on the 14th, they killed men in Susa. But again, it says they laid no hand on the plunder. It just wasn't of interest to them. Throughout the whole kingdom of Medo-Persia, it says they killed 75,000 of those who hated them on the 13th day of the 12th month. And they rested on the 14th day. So Mordecai then sent letters to the Jews throughout the kingdom, obliging them to keep the 14th day as a day of commemoration, of feasting and gladness, because God had delivered them. So the Jews were, they were so glad, so elated that this had happened, that Mordecai and Esther wrote them letters and a decree that all the Jews should celebrate these days. So that's what happened 2,499 years ago. And the Jews have been celebrating Purim ever since. So next year will be 2,500 years that the Jews have been celebrating this day. It's just a very, very important day to them. So although it may not be required in Leviticus chapter 23, it's really a significant day to the Jews. So that's kind of the story. I could go on to just say that Mordecai became a very great man in the kingdom. So he was very high and lifted up, second in rank only to King Ahasuerus himself. So I came up with a few takeaways that I observed, and this by no means is exhaustive, but just a few thoughts that I had, and you might have others. But one of the things that came to my mind is that leadership, for better or for worse, impacts the whole society. When a country, a city has good leaders, everybody profits. And when it has bad leaders, or in this case, impulsive leaders that make foolish decisions, the whole society suffers from that. Another one that came to my mind is from Proverbs 20, verse 11, where it says, "Wine is a mocker, strong drink a brawler. Whoever is led astray by them is not wise." It just seemed to me like drinking and drunkenness was a significant theme in this whole book, and kind of proving what it says here in Proverbs 20, verse 11. An obvious one is Proverbs 16, 18. Pride comes before a fall. Did we see that happen here? We saw that with Haman. He was very proud, and he met his end. It all came back on his head. Let's see. Okay. I like this one here. Proverbs 26, 27. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it. Did that happen to Haman? Certainly did, yeah. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it. Should have the courage to do what's right. Esther certainly didn't have to go through with this. She could have tried to evade her responsibility, tried to lay low, tried to not be noticed. But she had the courage to do the right thing. And also the power of intercessory fasting and prayer. In this case, she called a fast for all the Jews to fast for 3 days. And we saw God deliver the people. Okay, is there one more? Okay. So we talked earlier on about how some people don't think that this book should even be in the Bible. Luther, among others, said it shouldn't be because God's name wasn't even mentioned. But I guess I ask, was God in the book? It seemed to me it was. There's lots of little coincidences along the way or timing, things that were, if the king hadn't had insomnia that one night, what might have happened? Or if Esther hadn't been selected, there were probably hundreds of viable candidates to be the queen, but somehow or other, she was selected. And we see, regarding timing, we see that Mordecai discovered the plot against the king. He was in the right place at the right time, and he overheard these people plotting to assassinate the king. And I've already mentioned about the insomnia, that insomnia caused the king to wish to honor Mordecai. So those are just some thoughts. I'm sure you may have others. In fact, the more I look through this book, the more I see things that I just never saw before. It's a very well written book. It's got a lot of details that you may miss the first time or two that you go through it. But pretty rich book when it comes down to it. So with that, I think we should just close this time and we'll pray.